5 things you need to know as a landlord under the new Renters' Right Act. Ah, I can't believe you are still a landlord. There are much easier ways to make money. Like you really, I have so many videos that cover other ways that you can make money. Maybe you should just watch all of them. But maybe you are an accidental landlord, right? Maybe you bought a property 10, 15 years ago and you lived there and you thought this is a good way to generate passive income. I don't believe in passive income. And you go, oh no, what am I going to do as a landlord? Well, I would say over the longer term, you might want to reconsider whether you would still want to be a landlord. But in the short term, there's sort of 5 things that you need to be aware of. First thing first, you need to register yourself and your property in this thing called the private rented sector database. This is just a database where you register your name, your property, and the EPC rating, and so on and so forth. And you need to get that done by late 2026. Failure to do so means the first time offender will be fined £7,000 and the subsequent offenders could be fined up to £40,000. So, and you will also be prevented from possessing your property. So let's say if your tenants fail to pay rent and you want to take them to court, if you are not registered in this database, basically it means you can't take them to court. So really, really be mindful that this is one big major change you have to do. And just be aware of that and you can thank me later. The second thing you need to know as a landlord is you can only evict a tenant using Section 8. So Section 21 no longer applies. In the past, you could just serve a tenant like a 1 month notice and ask them to leave the property for whatever reason. Now, going forward from 1st of May onward, you can't evict them anymore. And even if you have an existing AST that whatever clause it is, if let's say the AST that you signed half a year ago says that this is a 12-month AST, the AST from 1st of May onward will automatically become a renewal basis, meaning the break clause will be void, the end of the tenancy will be void, and the tenants are legally allowed to live in the property for as long as they want, unless you serve them Section 8 eviction. And what's Section 8 eviction? So these are 4 main categories that are covered in Section 8 eviction. The first category is when you or your family are planning to move back into the property or you're planning to sell the property. So in which case you need to give the tenant 4 months notice to evict the property. And from the point the tenant evict the property, you're not allowed to re-let or market the property as a rental property for the next 12 months. So you have to bear that in mind. Other aspects of Section 8 will cover things such as the antisocial behavior or the tenant damage the property, in which case you can take action ASAP. And I don't think there's quite a lot of changes when it comes to that. But there is another one that would affect you as a landlord. So under Section 8, if the tenant didn't pay rent, you just need to wait for 2 months before you can serve an eviction notice to the tenants. And from that point, under the new law, you will have to wait for 3 months before you can serve that notice to the tenant and ask them to evict the property because of rent arrear. And even then, you need to give the tenant 4 weeks before they need to vacate the property. So just bear that in mind, right? Some landlords, they really rely on this month-to-month cash flow coming in to sustain themselves and pay their mortgage. So if you're one of those landlords, just bear that in mind. This is going to affect your ability to cover yourself as a landlord. There are ways to mitigate that. So come 1st of May, when this act is coming into place, financial check on your tenants become super important. You need to pay more attention to whether this tenant can pay their rent on time or not, because if they fail to pay, it's just going to take you much longer period of time before you can evict the tenant and get a new tenant in to start paying rent to sustain yourself. You could ask the tenants for things such as a third party guarantor. So these are either friends or family that are willing to step in and cover the rent on behalf of the tenant if he or she fails to pay their rent. Or you could ask the tenant to get a third party rent guarantor. These are companies where if the tenant failed to pay rent, the rent guarantor company will step in and pay rent for those tenants. But you need to really pay attention to the terms and conditions of this rent guarantor, meaning how long is the rent guarantor willing to pay the rents for and under what sort of conditions. And also, if the rent guarantor says they can cover up to 3 months of rent, and then 3 months later the tenant still didn't pay rent and they still live in your property, does that mean you can take the tenant to a tribunal and basically just get them to pay rent? So the timing of that is complex and important to you as a landlord. The other thing that you could do to mitigate your risk is to look at rent insurance, right? So you could basically buy an insurance to protect yourself in cases where your properties cannot be rented out or if your tenant didn't pay rent. But if the tenant has a rent guarantor and then you have a rent insurance, then you need to look at whether these two things are mutually exclusive, because the terms and conditions might differ with different companies. And this is where you might need to rely on a really good quality estate agent to help you navigate that. But I would say if I were a professional landlord or even an accidental landlord, I would look through the terms and conditions myself and comb through it with a fine-tooth comb just to make sure I am covered. Third thing that you need to know as a landlord, you cannot discriminate tenants based on whether they have family or not, or whether they are on social benefits. And the requests for pets have to be given due consideration. So if let's say you have a tenant who are already staying in the property and he or she want to get a pet, you can't just say no nilly-willy. There are still ways for you to say no. If let's say you are a leaseholder and the freeholder says this block of apartments are not allowed to have pets, then you can use that as a reason and explain yourself to the tenant and say, well, my freeholder doesn't allow this building to have any pets. So that's one way for you to politely say no to the tenant. Or if let's say there are other tenants living in the property and other tenants have evidence of severe allergy to pets, you can use that as a way to say no to these new tenants or new or existing tenants, and you say, sorry, pets are not allowed in this property. But I think you do have to show evidence that this tenant is definitely allergic to pets, right? You can't just say that without basis. Fourth point you need to know as a landlord is you need to make sure that your property is up to a livable, a basic, decent living standard. So it means the EPC requirement is minimum of E or better. And from 2030, the proposal is that the EPC requirement is C or better. So as a landlord, it might involve you spending quite a lot of money to update the EPC certificate of your property. So really do bear that in mind. And if you plan to sell the property because of that, I certainly don't blame you. And last but not least, the new Renters' Right Act is going to affect your ability to raise rent. With the new act, it means you're only allowed to raise rent once every 12 months. And if your tenants disagree with the amount of increase, they can bring you to the first tier tribunal and dispute that. And we don't know how long the first tier tribunal is going to take to decide whether the rent increase is justifiable or not. And doesn't matter how long they take, from the point that they decide, let's just say it takes them 3 months to decide that the rent increase is in line with market expectation, you can only raise rent again 12 months after the first tier tribunal have made that decision. So if you bought a property with the expectation that you can just increase rent, uh, as like every 6 months to increase your yield, that will no longer work. And if you're one of those landlords who's thinking of that, you have yourself to blame. Conclusion, and this is a short one. It doesn't make sense to be a landlord, at least not in places like London anyway. Maybe it still makes sense up north where the yield is much better. And there are so many other ways to make money. I cover things such as REIT, I cover things such as how to make money from the share market. I cover things such as how I made more than £7,000 in one single day. Really, there are other ways to make money. So really do consider whether you still want to be a landlord. And I know British people are so obsessed with being a landlord. And I just want to, before we end this video, I want to quote one statistic to you. The average age of landlords in the UK is 58 years old. And that tells you a lot about the mindset and the circumstances of those people who are landlord. When you think about it, 10, 20 years ago, interest rate was low. And when interest rate is low, it's amazing to be landlord because you can buy a property and sometimes you fix it up and then you refinance it, you increase the value of the property, you get more money out, and then you buy the second one and you buy the third one, and so on and so forth. This strategy is called the BRRR, meaning buy, renovate, rent, refinance, and repeat. And this strategy no longer works, which I cover in this video right here. And it just doesn't make sense to be a landlord anymore. And I know there are a lot of content creators out there selling you courses, telling you it's still amazing to be landlord. You can be a commercial real estate landlord. I think they're more interested in selling you an £8,000 course as opposed to helping you make money. So just really bear that in mind who you listen to that information from. So anyway, on a very sobering note, congratulations that you are a landlord, but you might want to reconsider how much longer you want to be a landlord here in the UK. Okay, well, I would love to hear your comment. Leave a comment below. And if you find this video useful, please click a like and a subscribe. I would greatly appreciate that. And tell your landlord friends about this video. Okay, bye.